I'm a first-year psychiatric resident coming here from Istanbul. So, apologize if my knowledge is wrong, but up to my knowledge, the epigenetic differences appears after the 2 generations. The generic knowledge is that, the empiric knowledge is that. So, as you mentioned before, that the traits of the character traits, we mentioned that religiously is not heritable, but the self-transcendence is heritable. So, is there knowledge that if the environmental or the other factors affect us, does it affect the other kind of kin, like other kin as a different traits, like the I'm sorry, I'm so nervous. So my question is that is there any epigenetic changes in the character traits, like for example self-transcendence, like if my granddad do something else, for to say, does my character changes? That's my question basically.
So you're asking if your character can be shaped by the choices of job you do or the activities? Is that the general issue? Yeah, deaths of like a grandfather or something like that?
Yeah.
Yes, it's a very important question because it's one of the things that shows that our character is dynamic and that it is something that we can cultivate. Because if you look at, this is some work that I published actually as far back as 1997. But when I was first studying temperament and character, I made a series of mistakes in a way that were very helpful. This is a point that you mentioned, that sometimes when we make mistakes, it's actually the most useful thing as a researcher. You don't always get it right, but you should always try to get it right. But what our first big effort was that I developed the measures of temperament. And we found that this could predict and distinguish the subtypes of personality disorders. And it was related moderately with whether you had a personality disorder or not. But there were many exceptions where someone could have a profile of being very anxiety prone and very easily angered, and also to be insensitive to social cues. So this would be like a prototype for someone vulnerable to a borderline personality disorder. But sometimes even the people who have about a 2/3 chance of becoming a borderline, based on their early personality, can turn out to be remarkably mature, stable, well-integrated people. So it'd be wrong about 1/3 of the time. And so we needed measures of character which directly measured the characteristics that made someone able to adapt well in society and manage their own life. And that's why I developed the character traits. And we did longitudinal studies where we followed people over time, and we found that temperament stayed relatively stable. But even that was a little bit misleading, because what was actually happening was that if someone had stressful life events, their harm avoidance might go up. And if they got into a very secure situation and they became comfortable in that, it might go down. And so that turned out that with temperament, there were about equal numbers of people who went up and who went down. It was changing, but the average was staying quite constant. With character, it's very different. With character, what happens is that I found that if I looked at someone's character structure at one point in time, and then we studied them a year or two later, or we did therapy with them, that they would change. They could change. But without a systematic treatment, they it was unlikely that they would change. And I couldn't predict whether or not they would change on their own. So I had to look to see what was determining the way they changed. And we found that if you look at the subscales of character, that what happens normally is that people add a little bit of cooperativeness, a little bit of self-directedness, and a little bit of self-transcendence in each critical period of their life, like early childhood. They develop, as you know, from psychoanalytic studies of psychosocial development, they first develop trust. If they're reared in an environment where the caretaker is addressing their needs and they feel loved and secure, even if they can't remember it, it's sort of the feeling that they bring to life. But that can be reversed later in life if the person who they came to view as the source of their security and their love dies or changes. And if they're not other people who fulfill these needs for caring and love, then they may sometimes react where they lose trust. And that has both a social component and it can also have a spiritual component. If someone, for example, asks the question, well, why would God take away my father? Why would he do that to me if he's a good God? And people have a lot of spiritual struggles when bad things happen in their life without realizing that ultimately, if we feel connected to everyone and everything, then this is just a way of deepening that understanding. But that's a complicated discussion. But the direct answer to your question is that one of the challenges I faced early was to understand why some people change and some people don't. And so a lot of my work since then has been to understand both the genetics and the environmental factors and the psychological aspects of a therapeutic alliance that allows people to be in a circumstance where they can grow in understanding themselves. And therefore, by having more insight, to express that in their life spontaneously without struggle. Because you don't do very well when you struggle with yourself. And you don't do very well when you struggle with other people either, because then they fight back. And so we need to find ways to accept ourselves and to accept other people and to accept our place in the world without feeling that we're dominated by fear and violence and doubt. So the conditions for change can be either to make you more insightful or less insightful. And so whereas temperament seems to stay steady except for a reaction to a specific kind of external event, with character you get jumps in insight where in an instant you look at the world differently. And we cultivate those jumps and changes by creating the conditions that make a person feel secure enough, respected enough, loved enough to look at things that are a bit painful and to accept the reality of that and to learn from it so that they can imagine a better future. And then in that process, they start to change the way character regulates their emotions and regulates the kinds of goals they select because it influences their values. And it regulates their recognition of a connection that's deep and inseparable, really, from other people and nature and the whole milieu in which they exist. And that's sort of a summary of the whole wisdom literature, whether it's pagan Platonism, or whether it's Judaism or Christianity or Islam. This is really a way of translating wisdom literature from ancient times that runs through all of human history. And really evolution, as you heard me this morning, where we can see, even with our ancestors who are prehistorical, that their artifacts that they've left with science and art and spirituality and arrowheads and so on, that these are things that show us that there's been a growth in cooperation, in purposeful behaviors, and then in self-awareness. Just as we now discover with genetics and brain imaging and psychotherapy research. So a very good starting question.
Okay. Now Ayşe, she's our resident in Marmara University Medical School. Okay, here.
Thanks for your presentation, stimulating presentation in the afternoon. I wonder that as an expert on personality and the evolution of personality, and also a professor trains psychiatrists, observes psychiatrists for years, what's your view about the evolution of the psychiatrists?
Would you say that?
The evolution of the psychiatrists, our profession, us, the change in us for generations.
Oh, you're asking me about the changes in the profession of psychiatry?
No, and also us, because you're a professor trains, observes psychiatrists for generations.
Okay.
And also I wonder, as a scientist working on genetics, psychiatric genetics, what will we evolve in the future, what we might or should be?
Your students ask good questions. This is a very important question because one of the real challenges, this is a very important question because, of course, it's very hard to look ahead and know what the world is going to look like and what our profession will look like. But I can give you a little perspective over the last 50 years of my experiences, seeing how at different times psychiatry has changed, sometimes for the better and sometimes for the worse. When I began in my psychiatry residency in 1970, we had I was in a department that was actually very medically oriented. Washington University was known for its emphasizing checklist diagnosis, and really is largely responsible, together with people at Columbia University in the US, for bringing us DSM-3. But unfortunately, the people in Washington University in St. Louis didn't think that the people in Columbia, who wrote the final version of DSM-2, really understood the principles, because they had created research diagnostic criteria for with checklists for only about 14 psychiatric disorders, and about 20% of the people couldn't be classified because they had an atypical course. So what we were doing was really picking 80% of people who could be, with confidence, described as fitting a prototype that was fairly clean cut. But we would put aside 20% of cases. And the idea was that with further study, we were going to find laboratory tests, and we were going to be able to explain the other 20%. But what actually happened was that it was shown that when you tried to explain the other 20%, it was because you had multiple overlapping syndromes. And that the idea that you had discrete disorders was really false because of the phenomenon of overlapping syndromes like we heard from Dr. Osser about the algorithms being very messy. It's very hard to listen to that kind of complicated algorithm because it's a shifting discussion about what are the overlapping disorders. And we never can explain more than this remaining 20%. You can always carve out some prototypic cases. So now DSM recognizes that it has reified the notion that there are these discrete syndromes. And everyone really knows that those are just syndromes and that they are not sharply defined because the brain doesn't have centers for specific disorders. And even when you try to carve out a circuit for depression and a circuit for persistence, even when you do it dimensionally, it turns out that all these regions actually are communicating with each other and collaborating with each other under different conditions. So this is the major kind of tragedy of our being pushed to diagnose people with a discrete syndrome rather than recognizing that there's a rich variety of variation within that syndrome and that these are not really separate disorders. And that really what I think a more informed way of understanding what we know about the complex organization of the brain and its function and its the way it can be modified is to recognize that even the dimensions that I described for you, like harm avoidance, is a simplification, and that what we really are seeing are profiles of multiple dimensions that can be understood as functions of different modules within the brain that are always interacting with one another. And for that reason, we can actually better describe the variability in a person and the fact that they are dynamically changing, and that we have to understand the functional regulation that leads some people to be healthier than others and give them a tool to understand themselves so that they understand that we are all constantly evolving and developing, and that we didn't develop discrete disorders. Biology wouldn't make any sense if there was a gene for schizophrenia. Instead, we have a vulnerability to entering into our imagination that sometimes is combined with a capacity to face unpleasant realities and to sometimes not trust other people. And so if you happen to get a vivid imagination with low self-directedness and low cooperativeness, you're going to be at risk for getting a psychosis. If you combine that same imagination with self-reliance and love and trust, then you get a Nobel Prize. And you know what the highest risk group for schizophrenia is? I mean, one thing obvious would be the relative of a schizophrenic, but actually there's a higher risk group for schizophrenia than having a parent with schizophrenia. Anybody want to guess? What is it? What was it? Drug users? No. Well, Robin Murray may tell us that that's a big risk group, and it is. If you use drugs during your adolescence, you're relying not on your understanding of how to adapt and cope, but you're just getting intoxicated so that you just let your emotions regulate your life. And that creates a developmental stagnation so that your character never matures. But the highest risk group for schizophrenia is actually to have a parent who's highly creative, like a Nobel laureate. Very high incidence of schizophrenia and psychoses in the relatives of Nobel laureates. Not if the son or daughter is lucky enough to also be cooperative and self-directed, along with having high intelligence and a vivid imagination, they'll do just fine. But if you combine that creativity, if you combine creativity without being self-reliant and willing to admit faults and to be able to trust other people, then you get a schizophrenic-like disorder, psychosis. So that's an example of why you can't just think of these things as there's a gene or a set of genes for schizophrenia and a different set of genes for bipolar disorder. It's much more complicated than that. And we have profiles of temperament and character that predispose you to the risk for all the syndromes. And I consider them, I think there's real utility in psychiatric diagnosis and in the categorical descriptions if you realize they're not really categories or taxons. They are really syndromes that can occur under certain conditions with certain profiles of personality. Now, to get to the rest part of so that was one big part of psychiatry. We're still struggling with the idea because the American Psychiatric Association needs to have DSM to support itself. And it knows that the categories are not real, in a sense. And yet it keeps doing this because it needs it to support itself. And all the rules for approving drugs are keyed to a specific syndrome. And yet we all know that you have to go beyond evidence-based research and use drugs based on your intuition and the kind of analysis of very complicated, incomplete, fuzzy, questionable data to make the most personalized assessment of what to do with any given person. So that's sort of, I think, the state of the field now is that a lot of psychiatrists are being pushed to do short-term sessions, brief, infrequent sessions, because there are not enough providers, and they're not, in the United States, only about 5% of psychiatrists do any psychotherapy.
5% doing psychotherapy?
Yes.
5%.
95% are only prescribing medications and doing interventional procedures like transcranial magnetic stimulation and so on. And so what now we're learning, though, this is completely inconsistent with what we know in cellular biology, or molecular biology, where we know that the function of cells and organisms is based on very complicated networks that are involve transfer of information. And that these are not simple systems with individual circuits or receptors or genes that cause a disorder very frequently. You can get some major genes and you can get some circuits, but that is a very incomplete account. And so the whole of molecular biology now is understanding the orchestration and the integration of collaborative modules within the body. And that has to be the future of mental health understanding of who we treat in a scientific way. And what's fortunate that it looks like, to my surprise, that the clinical tools like measures of temperament and character are so powerful that they explain what we can measure with very expensive studies for like brain imaging and whole genome scans. So you can, by knowing the person's life history, personality profile, the circumstances of their life, you can enter into a dialogue with them that is better than just having a CT scan or a resting state functional MRI, which costs, $1,000. You can just get to know them and help them get to know themselves. But that does take some time. But it's actually much more efficient and effective rapidly than giving them medication that doesn't really address the cause, only treats symptoms. And by treating the cause, which is really our understanding of ourselves and our relationship to the world, then we can get cure. People can actually get healthy and be well, rather than having to take medication the rest of their life. Now, maybe we can't treat everybody. It can be very difficult to get into contact and that kind of dialogue with someone who's severely paranoid or hallucinating. And so it isn't that we only use psychotherapy, but we need to know how to orchestrate our use of medications, interventional treatments, physical therapies, experiential therapies. And we have many things that we can do. But I think that's the real future. But there's another level too, if I want to look even a little bit further. Because what I just said, I think we could do now if there weren't so many regulations about diagnosis and payment and who you can give what prescription to. I think the real future is more like understanding the fact that how does the brain work with information that comes to it from a great distance? We know that we can actually remotely control the collaborative interactions in the brain of experimental animals like rats and mice with light, using optogenetic techniques. But the optogenetic techniques are actually only able to do that because the cells are sensitive to information in the frequency of light waves, in the visible range. Otherwise, the optogenetic receptors wouldn't work. So what we really have in the brain are energetic fields, electromagnetic fields, that allow things at a distance to communicate with each other almost instantaneously at the speed of light. And this means that we can use other kinds of therapies that are not very invasive to expose people to frequency variation of things that get them into a resonant state that is calm without medication. Just you can use heat and cold and exposure to light variation at about 8 hertz, which is a part of the standing wave field of the Earth. And this gets people to feel a connection to nature that they often don't get when they're exposed to a lot of pollutants and other disturbing, 5G and 4G iPhones. That there's so much electromagnetic pollution around us that we're often out of balance. And so there are resonance frequency therapies that are being developed, but they're pushed aside by the pharmaceutical industry. And I think we need to have more openness in considering this, but a lot more research has to be done. But the fundamental basis of understanding consciousness is not explained at all well by just the structural variation of nerve tracts in the brain. Because the brain communicates as a whole, because it's an electromagnetic field. And the transmission of information in neural tracts is too slow to account for shifts in quantitative EEGs. And this is not something new. I described this in my book, Feeling Good, The Science of Well-Being, in 2004. And it goes back to work that's been done for a couple of decades before that. But there's a lot of resistance to this because there's so much financial investment in other industries. But I think if you really look at the fact that receptor-based and pharmacologically approached approaches to understanding brain function simply cannot account for the speed of connectivity and the elegant coordination of multiple brain regions in a flash. And so we have to understand that there's another aspect to communication in the brain. The neural tracks are important. The functional connectivity, resonance is important. And we have to really understand how there's enough information transfer that it can coordinate the functional activity within a cell and between cells and in the person in relation to their community and the earth. And that really is kind of Star Trek medicine. Do you know that reference? You know Star Trek? Yeah. And we need a doctor to be able to wave the wands and get us in resonance, okay? But that won't be the whole story. Because if you depend on something outside of yourself, you're always going to be dependent on something external. And what you can have most confidence in is this inner understanding. And so we'll have to combine a way of understanding awareness and consciousness. Because it turns out, as I'll talk about in my talk on Tuesday, that self-awareness is what actually regulates the expression of our genes and the active information that allows the coordination of intracellular and intercellular and interorganismic processes.
Vahdet, Professor Vahdet Görmez is a child psychiatry professor.
That was such a challenging question, though, to foresee the future. So at least I can share my idea of the way, if we move forward in a way that deepens our knowledge, it'll be in that direction. I'm sorry, I didn't hear that. You need a microphone.
Thanks. Go on, please.
So actually, we all are grateful that you come here twice in a row here. It's a great pleasure to have you here, Professor. So I missed your presentation, but I would like to pick up from one of your comments.
You missed my talk?
Sorry?
You missed my talk this morning?
I missed it, sorry.
Well, I'm not going to talk to you.
I was elsewhere moderating a talk. Sorry, my apologies. So, if I got it right, you said the parental creativity is associated with schizophrenia in the offsprings. Did I get it right? Just to double check.
I'm sorry, I couldn't.
Yeah, you said parental creativity in parents.
Yes, right.
Is associated with schizophrenia in the offsprings of the person, of the parents.
Correct.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm a child psychiatrist. From developmental perspective, we know that parental childhood maltreatment, any act of omission or any act of commission, they are also associated with schizophrenia or psychosis in later life. So do you see any link between parental creativity and childhood maltreatment and any adverse events in childhood that would make certainly kids more prone to develop psychosis in future?
Yes, because if someone does have a predisposition to vivid imagination and creativity, and they have experiences where their needs are not met, and they will tend to develop distrust and self-doubt from the experiences of their early part of their life as an infant and as a toddler and as a preschooler. And that can then put them in a direction where they would have schizotypal traits. Now that can depend as well partly on their temperament, because if they're low in reward dependence so that they don't form attachments easily, and they're high in harm avoidance, then they'll tend to be asocial from their temperament. And if you combine an asocial temperament and a schizotypal character structure, which is high self-transcendence with low self-directedness and low cooperativeness, what happens is then they get perceptual aberrations and many illusions, and that can progress to actual full-blown psychosis under stressful conditions. And we've shown that by very nice studies where you look at not just a person with schizophrenia and their relatives, but also the non-psychotic siblings of a schizophrenic. And because the personality traits are heritable, but the person isn't psychotic, you still find that there's an increase in the predisposing temperament and character profiles, so that has to be a heritable susceptibility factor that is not always expressed. Just as the monozygotic twin studies show that, maybe only half or so of monozygotic twins where one is schizophrenic, will the other one also be schizophrenic? So there's a susceptibility that comes from biases in the way we learn and respond to circumstances in our life that leads this to be manifest in some and not in others.
Great, thank you very much.
One last question would be from, yes. Oh, you will ask. Then last two questions. Mr. Professor Türkçapar, he's a CBT therapist, very eminent CBT therapist and professor of psychiatry.
Thank you very much for your talk and information. Actually, I have an anthropology PhD. My dissertation thesis is on the cultural aspects of the personality. And when we compare with the TCI scores, we found that when we compare our results with the US normative data, we found that there is a significant difference between Turkey and US population. I mean, our samples had high harm avoidance. Do you have any thoughts about that? Maybe Kemal also could talk.
What was the finding?
Yeah,
it was
Turkish sample.
Higher harm avoidance?
Harm avoidance significantly.
We have large-scale TCI data in over 25 countries now. And we found that basically the structure of personality is the same in most countries, but there are circumstances where you can get changes in whether a scale is high or low, but the relationship of that scale to other scales tends to be very similar. When we look at the higher order relationships, the configurations of temperament and character, we discovered that the three groups that I described in my talk of a creative character with a reliable temperament and an organized character with a reliable temperament and then a very emotionally reactive group, that is very stable across many countries, and it corresponds to Englehart's findings in the World Value Study, where the unregulated people that we would say have personality disorders are often described in the sociological literature as traditional subtypes. And they like to stick with convention, they don't like change, they look up to authorities to help them, and so they're very traditional and conservative in that sense. And they're really primarily using their habit system to get through life with very weak character development. Then the group that Englehart called moderns, or materialists, were very individualistic. They would also work for mutual benefit if it was going to help them too, but they wouldn't be altruistic. and they tend to be rather self-serving, and they're egocentric rather than allocentric. And then there's a group of post-materialists that sometimes are also called cultural creatives, and those you can combine just because the numbers, each of these three is about a third of the population. But at least that was true 10 years ago. But you can also divide the post-materialists who are just beginning to have some of these peak experiences of an outlook of unity from those who, in which it's more stable. But I'll talk about this on Tuesday with some data where I give you some other metaphors that'll help you to remember this. But we found in a study in Bulgaria, which, as you know, nearby here, has been repeatedly conquered, that it's a very secular, rationalistic culture. And there are few people who are expressing the creative profile. There are some, but the numbers are so small that when we do large-scale studies, that we can really explain most of the data with just the organized and the traditional group, and there are not so many of the creative types. So you can get that kind of variation. And when we initially analyzed that data, we knew that there were a few countries that didn't have the same structure. And so our problem was to know, was it a problem in the quality of the translation? Or is there really a sociological difference in that country? And there are some cases where I think there is really a cultural sociology does show that a history of repeated suppression and distance and control, an absence of democratic values, an absence of freedom, much violence, much crime, much inequity. These can drive up your fear and discourage you. Yeah. Well, but you know, you can also see that it might depend on the circumstances in the society at the time, because a society, individual well-being and collective well-being cannot be separated. If you are in a society in which there's inequity and violence and suppression, just as the saying goes, that, you know, if there's injustice to one person, there's really injustice to all. We're all vulnerable, and we feel that insecurity. And so harm avoidance then goes up.
In times of coup d'etat, for example, our country has seen 3 coups d'etats almost. So after those times, turbulent times, people might feel harm avoidance much stronger than ever before.
Exactly. And we know that harm avoidance can be very much provoked. But remember, just to illustrate this, though, to give you an example of the dynamics of it, there's very nice studies that we did early on with temperament alone, in which we looked at the effect of the expectation that you bring to a situation. So we had groups of people who were high in harm avoidance and were exposed to a stressful situation. And in that situation, their startle reflex is exaggerated. We had another group of people who were low in harm avoidance and were encouraged to think about pleasant things. And then we got a reduction in the startle response. So, you know, the startle response is exacerbated in PTSD, but this partly reflects the fact that they're both harm avoidant and they have a lot of intrusive memories that are unpleasant and adverse. And so that's the circumstances in which you get exaggerated startle reflexes. And so you have to really pay attention to both what is the person's stable view of the world. Do they feel separate? Do they feel at risk? Do they feel devalued? Or do they feel loved and encouraged and so on? You know, are they living in a therapeutic environment, or are they living in an anti-therapeutic environment? And so our jobs as professionals is to create, at least temporarily, a therapeutic environment in which people can feel safe enough and respected enough to begin then to look at themselves without judging and blaming themselves, to accept themselves, and then proceed with cultivating a life with this expanded self-acceptance, self-love, self-compassion. And that's why I think it's really tragic when 95% of American psychiatrists just pay attention to drug algorithms and don't do psychotherapy. Or they consider what Dr. Osser said, that a personality disorder, well, you know, that takes years to do. And they're not going to respond anyway. It's going to be incomplete and so forth. And just basically ignore personality disorder without knowing who the person is. It's just almost unimaginable for me. But I know that most of my colleagues who trained with me still think that way. Because they haven't had the privilege of being able to do the kind of research and self-inquiry that I've had, because they were struggling to follow the rules that the drug companies and the insurance companies impose on us. And somehow I managed to sidestep that. But this is really the challenge of the field. In almost every country throughout Europe and in the Americas. It's not just US, it's not just Turkey. This is really the challenge of our whole field. And it's young, bright, smart, inquiring minds like yours who care to ask the kinds of questions you've been asking that really can change things. And you don't have to do it loudly. You can just do it by, you know, your service to other people and the kind of way you do your practice, the way you relate to your friends, and so on. We all can do a lot just by the way we live our own life and the choices we make. Because you don't have power to control the country. No one does.
And one final question from Professor Aynur Görmez.
I'm a general adult psychiatrist with special interest in neurodevelopmental disorders. Neurodevelopmental disorders, yeah. I still can't get my head around the link between creativity and risk of psychosis.
Between what?
Between creativity in parents and the risk of psychosis. Well, I was just wondering whether what seems to be appearing as creativity could actually be the representation of high-functioning autism. Because people with high-functioning autism can be very creative and might have difficulty with attaching with their offsprings, living in their own world and doing a bit different or atypical stuff.
Well, let me begin by first describing a little better what we know about the things that make a person vulnerable to illusions and cognitive hallucinations. And you know, are you familiar with the Chapman scales for psychosis proneness? There are various measures that look at such things as social alienation that also involve vulnerability to illusions and so on. And basically, the susceptibility to the scales that measure vulnerability to hallucinations and perceptual aberrations or schizotypy correlate 0.95 with the schizotypal profile of the TCI character scales. And that is a high self-report of self-transcendence and low scores in self-directedness, and usually self-directedness and cooperativeness. So that means that people have low self-esteem, they can't admit faults, they don't trust other people, and they still report that they are great and wonderful, and that kind of vanity and inability to admit faults and limitations is really not true self-transcendence, as anything in the wisdom literature would suggest. It's a grandiose, inflated kind of megalomania that is a false image of someone who will describe themselves in ways that looks a lot like self-transcendence, but it isn't, in the sense that these people don't identify with the world. They don't feel one with the world. They feel like they're superior to the world. And that they don't, and that's a defense, a grandiose defense against trusting and loving the world humbly, because they don't have humility. They don't have the ability to admit faults. So this is one of the interesting paradoxes, that many people with severe personality disorders had very low self-transcendence or very high self-transcendence. And it was only when we looked at the profiles that we understood that what they were reporting about themselves was an illusion. And so psychosis proneness is really very well identified by the TCI, but people got confused and would say that, well, self-transcendence is not desirable because we see it in a lot of severe personality disorders. But that isn't real self-transcendence, and it would not meet our criteria for the creative profile that is mature and that has self-awareness. It's a kind of a psychometric distortion, but it's not a flaw, because this is the way people see themselves. It's just not a realistic image. So that's one part of it. Do you understand the psychometric dilemma? That some people will describe themselves in a wonderful way, but it's just completely inconsistent with the usual psychological foundation for that kind of description. Now, but as a neurodevelopmental psychologist or child psychiatrist, you have to also know that what self-awareness does, and this is what I'll talk about on Tuesday, what it does is to regulate gene expression, and that includes early neurodevelopment. And so if you're raised by a mother who's under stress, and you feel this way that she's seeing the world as a threatening, uncomfortable, insecure place, then there can be biases that begin even in utero that can affect neurodevelopment. And early development can be irreversibly misdirected as a result of this kind of fetal environment. And we know that the people who are low in self-directedness often have, low in self-awareness, often have neurodevelopmental abnormalities. There are many syndromes that we've identified. So there are actual neurodevelopmental abnormalities that can be related to these problems in the developing view of the world that the fetus has. So some of these developmental issues begin before birth. Then, in addition, once you're born with a certain level of emotional reactivity and a certain capacity for regulation of gene expression, you may be more or less vulnerable to forming good relationships. You might be, for example, a very difficult child rather than an easy child. And these are based on different, we can measure them with the TCI, but we can also measure them with a wide variety of other tests for infant temperament. So I have a paper in translational psychiatry in 2019 that reviews that literature and shows a lot of the relationships between various measures of temperament. And those are important factors too. So I think that work can tell you a number of things both about the clinical aspects and the neurodevelopmental aspects, if you want to look at it in more detail.
Many thanks, Professor Cloninger. Alkışlıyoruz hocamızı. It's been a quite exhaustive day. So I think we can have a photo as a memoir of this evening with all the participants. And I will send it to the Burkon organization and can distribute to you.
Thank you for your questions. They were very good ones.